One of the terrible disasters of the 20th century in Jewish life, which the Holocaust caused, was the disappearance of many ancient Jewish communities that had existed for thousands of years and seemingly would continue to exist, and they were snuffed out. But there were Jewish communities that later were snuffed out, not so much by the Holocaust as by the coming of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is naturally the indirect cause, but the Jewish communities that lived in Arab countries and Muslim countries, where again Jews lived for many centuries and had established large and wealthy and influential communities, all of those communities were also destroyed. And there are just a few meager remnants of those communities that still exist today. So tonight's lecture concerns itself with the great Jewish community that existed in Egypt. And it's a community that existed for at least 2,600 years consecutively, which is a long time. It's about 60 generations, and existed under all sorts of different conditions and rulers and empires, and somehow was able to survive them all. But in the 1950s, with the arrival of Nasser as the head of Egypt, the Jewish community was forcibly diminished. And by the end of the 1967 war, then the Jewish community was practically eliminated. And today it's estimated that there are 40 to 50 Jews that still exist in Egypt, out of a community that in the 1930s numbered close to 70,000. So we see a pattern here, and in fact that's going to be the pattern for this lecture series, of the story of great communities that existed for long periods of time, the vicissitudes that it underwent, and the fact that it is, for all practical purposes, no longer on the Jewish map of the world today. The Jewish story with Egypt, we all know, begins with the fact that we were slaves in Egypt in about the year 1600 before the Common Era. And then the Exodus from Egypt in about the year 1312 before the Common Era. And then the independent Jewish states, there were two states, the Kingdom of Judah and the Kingdom of Israel, the northern tribes, all had relations with Egypt. They had alliances with Egypt. Sometimes they fought with Egypt. But basically the Jews depended upon Egypt to defend it from the northern kingdoms, from Assyria, from Babylonia, from Aram. And since Israel was in the middle of the two great empires, the southern empire located in Egypt, the northern empire located in Mesopotamia, so Israel was always involved in these wars, and the Jews basically relied on Egypt as an ally. Well, they weren't much of an ally, and when the destruction of the first temple occurred, 90% of the Jews were exiled to Mesopotamia, but 10% of the Jews went to Egypt. And the Jews that went to Egypt were led by the prophet Jeremiah, by the Novi Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu went to Egypt, and he helped establish the Jewish community in Egypt. The Novi Yechezkel, the prophet Yechezkel, went to Bovel, went to Mesopotamia, and helped establish the Jewish community there. The Novi Yirmiyahu dies in Egypt. We don't know his burial place, though. There have been many places naturally assigned or ascribed that that's where he's buried. And the Jewish community begins. We have records that there were Jewish mercenaries who were professional soldiers for the Persian army, for the Persian Empire, after the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and they were in the neighborhood of the Aswan Dam today. And we have something called the Elephantine Papyrus, which is a record of letters that the Jewish soldiers wrote to the rabbis and to the priests in the land of Israel, that they asked them when Pesach comes, send us a calendar, questions in halacha, because they were stuck in this outpost of the Persian Empire, and they were mercenaries, hired soldiers that protected the border of the Persian Empire from the barbarians on the other side. These Jews eventually settled in Egypt, and eventually a Jewish community arose in Egypt, so that by the time that Alexander the Great came to the Middle East in about 325 before the Common Era, there is a considerable Jewish population. Considerable is a relative term. There were maybe 3,000 Jews in Egypt, but in relationship to the numbers of those times, it was a considerable community. We all know Alexander founds the great city of Alexandria, which he modestly names after himself. And Alexandria became the center of Greek culture. It became the center of everything that Greece stood for. And in Alexandria, there was a large Jewish community. When Alexander died, his general Ptolemy the First, became the emperor of the southern kingdom of Egypt. And at that time, they took a census, and 1 out of every 8 residents in Egypt was Jewish. Was an eighth of the population, 12.5% of the population was Jewish. The Jews were concentrated in the city of Alexandria, though there were Jews in the outlying farming areas as well. And Alexandria became a great Jewish city. Alexandria, to a certain extent, was what we would say today the New York of its day, meaning that it wasn't a majority Jewish city. It was predominantly a non-Jewish city, predominantly a Greek city, but the Jewish influence was so strong and the Jewish presence was so noticeable that the people thought of Alexandria as being a Jewish city, and not only that, the Jews thought of it as being a Jewish city. Alexandria shel Mitzrayim was famous, and the Jews were wealthy. They were engaged in 3 different occupations. They were farmers, owned land and farmed it. But more than that, they were in the army. It's hard to think of Jews in the army until our day here in Israel. But in Egypt, the Jews were a formidable section of the Egyptian army, and they were the tax farmers, the tax collectors, which was a very powerful and influential position, also very remunerative. The system in the ancient world for collecting taxes was that you didn't go to everybody's house and say, file an income tax return, but rather what you did is you put it out for bid, a tender, and somebody paid, let's say, $5 million, gave it to the government, and then he had the right to go to everybody's house and ask for the taxes. And he naturally hoped to collect $10 million. So the government had the money in advance, and it didn't have the bother of collecting the taxes, But those people who were the tax farmers, who were in charge of the taxes, had a very great lucrative business because the government would support them and even enforce physically the payment of taxes to the tax farmers. So the Jews were in that business, and the Jews were also a major part of the police force. So the Jews were very powerful, very wealthy. They also were artisans, silversmiths, goldsmiths, merchants, traders. The Talmud tells us that in Alexandria they built a synagogue that was so large that you could not hear the chazan. We have that even in smaller synagogues, but in but here it was because of the size of the synagogue, and that therefore they had to raise flags to signal when to say Amen, when to stand up for Kedusha, for Kaddish, for whatever, with the signal wherever they were in the services, because the synagogue was so large. The rabbis also said that in the synagogue people sat in the groupings of their occupations, so that the goldsmiths sat in one section, and the silversmiths in another section, and the Talmidei Chachamim in a third section. So in effect you had a whole bunch of what today we would call shtiblach, all in one place in this enormous, beautiful synagogue. The Jews in Alexandria were so wealthy, and they were so powerful, and they were so self-confident that they built the Bet HaMikdash. They built a temple in a place called Leontopolis in about the year 200 before the Common Era, and it was built by a descendant of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol in Yerushalayim, and he was the last of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly. He was the great Jew. They called him Shimon HaTzadik. But my friends, Tzidkus is not inherited. If it were, we would all be probably a little better than we are. And therefore, there's opinion that it was his son, his grandson, but it definitely was a descendant of his who was not elected, not chosen to be the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. So, you know, if you don't win the primaries, what do? You switch parties, right? You go somewhere else. That's human nature. So he went to Egypt and he built this temple. They raised all this money and he built an enormous temple, and they had the exact same services in the temple in Egypt that they had in the temple in Yerushalayim. And he said he's the Kohen Gadol. This temple lasted for almost 300 years. It was destroyed after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, so then the Romans destroyed that temple also. But, you know, to us it's almost unimaginable that such a thing could happen, and this is during the time of the great Tanoim, and the people of the Mishnah, who evidently were unable to control the situation and were unable to prevent it from happening. And so the Jews of Alexandria, nobody bigger, stronger than they. And they became acculturated. Ptolemy's grandson, Ptolemy Philadelphus, sponsored the translation of the Torah into Greek, the Targum Hashivim, the Septuagint. The Talmud tells us that he had 70 rabbis in 70 separate rooms, and the miracle was that everybody came up with the same translation. I think that's one miracle. I think the second miracle is he got 70 rabbis to agree about one thing. That also smacks of the supernatural. And because of that, in Alexandria, they read the Torah in Greek. The Kriyas HaTorah was in Greek. And in the Gemara and Megillah, we see that Greek was held to be a holy language. And that other translations were not allowed, let's say into Latin or other languages, but Greek was held to be, had somehow a status, a stature in Jewish life. It was something special. And this was because of the Jews of Alexandria. The great Jewish philosopher and leader of the Alexandrian community, Philo, who traveled to Rome and represented Jewish interests, probably couldn't read Hebrew. Because Hebrew, even Aramaic, was hardly known in Egypt. It was purely Greek. But what happened was that Greece went under. The Jews tried to explain Judaism to the Greeks, and the Jews also tried to assimilate into Greek culture. They all took Greek names, and I mentioned they all wrote Greek. All the monuments of the Jewish community are in Greek. The tombstones are in Greek. It was, the Jews felt very comfortable with it. The Jews who lived outside of Alexandria in the smaller communities were much more pious than the Jews of Alexandria. Jews of Alexandria were lax. We find from Josephus and other sources, were lax in Sabbath observance and were lax even in laws of kashrut. But they were Jews, and they steadfastly remained Jews. We find almost no instances of conversion amongst the Jews of Alexandria. But they weren't very scrupulous in the observance of halakha. What is also interesting is that during the reign of during the reign of Alexander Yanai, the great Hasmonean king, in about the year 100 before the Common Era, he drove many of the great rabbis out of the land of Israel, and they went to Egypt. Shimon ben Shotach was in Egypt. Others were in Egypt. That was the place of refuge. So when they came to Egypt, they strengthened the Egyptian Jewish community, much as the Eastern European Jews who came to the United States and to other places after the war strengthened the indigenous community by their knowledge and their sense of purpose and observance. When the Romans came, the Romans treated the Jews differently. They were less kind. And what happened was there was a great competition now between the Greeks and the Jews. And you have the beginnings of official anti-Semitism. The Greeks wrote anti-Semitic tracts, many of which still exist today and are in use today. All of the complaints about Jews and conspiracies and money and everything else, you know, and all of that was written 100 years before the Common Era. It's 2,100 years old. There are no chidushim. There's no new anti-Semitism. It's all a rehash of the same thing. We even have a blood libel that dates back to that period of time. So when Christianity came, it just adopted almost whole the previous classical anti-Semitism. And then there was a Roman author by the name of Appian who wrote a great anti-Semitic tract in which everything that Goebbels and Streicher wrote, and the Nazis and the communists and what everyone writes about Jews, he wrote it 2,000 years earlier. And Josephus answered him by writing a tract called Contra Appian, against Appian, which is really the first written Jewish defense against anti-Semitism. But in Alexandria now there were pogroms. Jews were killed, and what happened is that the Jews also perpetrated reverse pogroms. And the Jews attacked the Greek community, and killed Greeks. So there was like a civil war that went on between the Greeks and the Jews. The Romans encouraged the civil war, because what they were afraid of is that the Greeks and the Jews would unite, and that would make Alexandria and Egypt much harder to govern. But by having the minorities, the divide and conquer type of colonial rule, which England perfected in the 19th and early 20th centuries. What happened here in the land of Israel is only one example. India, other places, where the way to control the country was simply to take the different groups and set them up against each other. And then everybody needed the protection of the government in order for them to survive. So there were these pogroms and reverse pogroms. It was a very, very difficult time. In about the year 30 before the Common Era, the Emperor Caligula, who was a madman, absolute madman, and who was very anti-Semitic, he encouraged mobs to attack the Jews in Egypt, to attack them in Alexandria. The synagogues were burned down. Many hundreds of Jews were killed. But when Caligula himself was assassinated in 40 after the Common Era, 41 after the Common Era, so then the Jews took their vengeance against the Greeks, so that Alexandria was almost destroyed as a city because of the civil war between the Greeks and the Jews. When the Romans finally destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, so many Jews escaped to Egypt, and the Alexandrian community was rebuilt, and Jewish life there began strongly again. But the Jews in Alexandria revolted against the Romans. It's interesting when we don't think of the Jews in that light, but in 115 of the Common Era, there was a great revolt throughout the Middle East of Jews against the Romans. This is even before Bar Kokhba. It's 20 years before Bar Kokhba would mount the rebellion in the land of Israel. And the Romans had to assign large armies to put down the rebellions. And thousands of Jews were killed. And then the Romans said they had enough, and in 117 they completely crushed the Jewish community of Egypt, of Alexandria, almost to the extent that we hear nothing again about the Jewish community till 250 years later. Come now the Christians. So Christianity was centered in Alexandria. It was one of its main centers. Antioch in the north, Alexandria in the south. It was never centered in the land of Israel, because the Jews didn't accept Christianity, and the Romans didn't accept Christianity, and therefore in the homeland, so to speak, where Christianity was born, it found it very difficult to take root. It took root in Byzantium and Constantinople. It took root in Alexandria, took root in Antioch, but it didn't take root in the land of Israel. In Alexandria, the church became very strong, and the church adopted the anti-Semitism of the Greeks, the classical anti-Semitism, and it was combined with the religion of Christianity and the fact that the Jews had rejected Christianity, and therefore it was a very, very difficult time for the Jews in Alexandria. Nevertheless, the Jews persevered, but there were pogroms all of the time. In 415, there was a great pogrom in Alexandria that almost destroyed the entire Jewish community, but the Jews kept coming back, because Alexandria was a center of culture, was a center of commerce, and because the Jews felt they had an attachment. They'd already been there almost 1,000 years, and therefore they were willing to come back every time. The Christians would have destroyed the Jews in Egypt, just as they would have destroyed the Jews in the land of Israel in the Middle East. The Byzantine Christians really set out on a campaign of genocide against the Jews, except that what happened is that in the interim, in the 7th century, in 622, Islam comes. The Muslims come. And the Muslims drive out the Christians from the Middle East, and the Muslims drive them out of Egypt. And now you're under Muslim rule. So the first Muslim rulers were the Abbasids. The Abbasids were Sunni Muslims. You know, the Muslims also are divided. We should not think of them being monolithic. They're Sunni. 70% of the Muslim world are Sunnis. 30% are Shiites and other smaller sects. The difference between them is of some importance. The Sunnis are, to a certain extent, more moderate and tolerant. The Shiites are less. And the Shiites have strange beliefs regarding a lost caliph who hasn't been heard from in about 1,200 years. They're waiting for him to come back. Sounds familiar. And all sorts of other things. But the Abbasids were Sunni Muslims. And under the Muslim rule, the Jews began to prosper again. And the Jews lived in 3 main cities: Alexandria, Fayum, and Fostad, which later would become, which absorbed in Cairo. And Fostad was the capital of the Abbasids, of the Caliph. And the Muslims, from the beginning on, insisted on having Jewish physicians. All of the court doctors were Jews. And in order to give it greater prestige, the doctors of the court usually were the person that was appointed as the Nagid. The Nagid was, here in Israel, it's the head of the central bank. But it used to be that the Nagid was like the prince of the Jewish people. He represented the Jewish people to the court. We'll see later Rambam and his son and his grandson and his great-grandson were all Nagidim in Egypt. All had that stature. It was a great title, and the title carried with it power as well. What happened, though, is that eventually the Abbasids became corrupt. People were dissatisfied with them, and they were evicted by the Fatimids. Now, the Fatimids were Shiite Muslims. The Abbasids, interestingly enough, then went to Spain. And it's under the Abbasids in Spain that the Jews had the Golden Age. And they were evicted from the Middle East, and they went to Spain. And in the Middle East, the Fatimids took over. Now, in Egypt, there developed a great school of Torah learning, especially in the city of Fayum. So you have Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon. The great Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon was born and educated in Fayum. And in fact, he signs all of his letters and all of his books, Saadia al-Fayumi, Saadia who comes from Fayum. And Egypt was the counterweight to Babylonia. The Gaonim in Bovel, and there were Gaonim in Egypt as well. And Egypt, the Egyptian Jewry, saw itself as an equal to the strength of Babylonian Jewry. And they were, again, powerful, wealthy. They engaged in commerce, in banking. The trade routes went through Alexandria. The ports were in Alexandria. The Nile was the main artery to bring the riches of Africa to Europe. And the Jews were strong and powerful, and they had the great Talmidei Chachomim, they had the great scholars as well. The third Fatimid Caliph, a man by the name of El-Hakim, he's the founder of the Druze, which is an offshoot of Islam, and even today it's a sort of a mysterious religion that is based on Islam, but it is not Muslim. And the Druze are here in Israel, they're in Syria, they're in Lebanon, and they were originally in Egypt as well. He forcibly converted Christians and Jews to his religion. But then he had a dream one night. You always have to watch what you eat for supper. He had a dream one night, and he was threatened with death in the dream. And because of that, therefore, he got up in the morning and he forcibly made everybody that he converted go back to the religion that they converted from. Also in Egypt, Egypt was the center of the Karoim, of the Karaites. The Karoim arose also, just like I told you about the temple that they made in Egypt. Well, there was a man by the name of Anan, and he wanted to be appointed as the Gaon, as the head of the Golus in Babylonia. They didn't appoint him. Because they didn't appoint him, he went out and made his own religion. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter used to say, in Yiddish, he said, Alles fangt sich an mit Midas. Everything begins with human traits. And that's what the Balei Musar emphasized. So many times you see great philosophies and great things, and it all is nothing. It all is only, me. And especially in a democratic society, all of us have to be aware of that, and without being cynical, but I don't think we should ascribe great motives to people who rule, because they are controlled usually by smaller personal motives, which are masked by slogans and ideologies and philosophies, but really are only a reflection of children playing in the sandbox. It's my turn, it's my ball, etc. So Adan founded this sect of the Karaites. He said, "This is all the Judaism of the last 2,000 years is wrong. This is the new Judaism," and he rejected all rabbinic interpretations. He rejected the Talmud. He took the Bible literally, and the Karaites were very strong and very powerful. We see how powerful they were. That Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon devoted almost his entire career to fighting the Karaites, first in Egypt and later in Babylonia. And the entire book, the Amunos V'Deos that he wrote, the book of beliefs and opinions, is as much an argument against the Karaites as it is against the other religions in the world. Egypt had a very strong Karaite community. 35 to 50% of the population were Karaites. So that when Maimonides, when the Rambam comes to live in Egypt, so the Rambam was born in Cordoba in Spain. When he was 15 years old, he and his family fled to North Africa from the revolution of the Almohads. After hiding in the mountains, in the Atlas Mountains for years, they lived in caves. In fact, the Rambam wrote the Perush HaMishnayos, his great work, he wrote it in a cave, without books. He eventually comes to the land of Israel, and he wants to settle in the land of Israel. But he comes to the land of Israel when the Crusaders are here. And when the Crusaders were here, there was no Jewish settlement worthy of the name. And it was a terrible danger. And he was welcomed in Akko, which was then just about the only Jewish settlement. But he couldn't find himself. He traveled to Tiberias. He then traveled to Jerusalem. He then traveled to Gaza. And then he came to Egypt. And he settled in Fostad. At this time, there arises a new leader in the Muslim world, Salah al-Din, the Emperor Saladin, who is the Caliph in Egypt, and the Rambam becomes the court physician for Salah al-Din. He became really the court physician for the family and for the hundreds of wives that the emperor had. And the Rambam becomes the head of the Jewish community in Egypt. Now, here he has a choice. One choice is to go directly against the Karaites, to read them out of the party, to exclude them. But the Rambam did not do that. The Rambam instead worked with them so that by the end of his 30 years of heading the Jewish community in Fostad, most of the Karaites became Rabbinites already. They changed, they became Rabbonis. He was able to win them over. And in general, we find that that was the policy of the Rambam regarding all controversies, was that instead of facing it head on, he always attempted to finesse it, to go around it, because he felt that eventually they would be won over. But so Rabbeinu Sadia tried to break the Karaites, and he was moderately successful in so doing. The Rambam was enormously successful in removing the Karaites. The Karaites shrank to about 7 or 8% of the Jewish population in Egypt, and he did so by education, by a process of inclusion rather than a process of exclusion. And as I mentioned, he was the Nagid, and then his son Rabbeinu Avraham was the Nagid, and then his grandson Rabbeinu David was the Nagid, and the Maimonidean family were the heads of Egyptian Jewry for about 200 years. When Benjamin of Tudela visits Egypt, so he says there were about 3,000 Jews in Alexandria, and maybe another 4,000 or 5,000 Jews in the rest of the country. But he said the Jews were wealthy, and they were strong, and they had great academies of learning, and they also had a broad outlook on the world, so to speak. They were cultured, they all spoke Arabic, they were engaged in many different trades, and somehow they were known as leading practitioners of the medicine of its time. They were especially expert in pharmacology and drugs and herbs. We have, for instance, the Rambam's medical treatises are almost always devoted to what types of drugs and herbs can help people, and also what we would call today preventive medicine. Instead of curing the disease when it comes, but rather how to live a lifestyle that prevents disease from coming. Saladin, under the influence of the Rambam, allowed the Jews to come back to the land of Israel, and he allowed Jews to settle in Yerushalayim again. So that in the 1200s you already have again a Jewish community here in Jerusalem, all because of the Egyptian caliphs. However, this was not long-lived, because the Egyptian caliphs did not trust the Egyptians to be in their army. So what they did is they hired Turkish soldiers, the Mamelukes, who were really slaves, and they hired them to be the mercenaries. Well, once you let the, let the wolf in to guard you, eventually he'll eat you. And that's what happened. that at the end of the 1200s, the Mamelukes take over, and for the next 200 years, Egypt is ruled by the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes persecuted the Jews something awful, both here in the land of Israel and in Egypt. The Egyptian community shrank at one time to barely 300 souls. The Jews were forbidden to do business, they were forbidden to be doctors, they were forbidden to have commercial interests. It was the Rambam's family then left Egypt and immigrated to Turkey. It was a black time for the Jews in Egypt. However, what happened is that in 1517, the Ottoman Turks came and destroyed the Mamelukes. So we see what we're going through here, right? We started with the Egyptians, and then we had the Greeks, and then we had the Romans, and then we had the Byzantine Christians, and then we had the different Muslim groups that ran the country, and then we had the Mamelukes, and now we have the Ottoman Turks that come. So the Ottoman Turks, I mean, that's Suleiman the Magnificent. Those are the walls of the old city, and he again builds up Alexandria, and not only builds it up, he imports Jews to run it for him. The Jews became the government officials again, they became the tax collectors, they became the customs agents to collect the customs at the port. So they also worked the same way. You didn't collect customs from every ship. The man who got the right to collect customs paid, let's say, $1 million a year, and then he went out and he collected from every ship whatever he could. So it was a chance that you took. Sometimes you'd make money, sometimes you'd lose money, but the government was not interested in the customs. It was a business that you went ahead and took care of it yourself. The Ottoman Turks also persecuted the Jews, but they persecuted the Jews for money. They were extortionists, and they leveled taxes on the Jews. The Jews always came up with the money. That was the problem. So once you always came up with the money, so then, you know, then it works. There's a famous story that the Jew in 1523, that Ahmed Pasha, who was appointed the governor in Alexandria, demanded an enormous amount of money, and it said it had to be paid by this and this day. And the Jews didn't know how to pay it, and he said otherwise he was going to kill all the elders of the community, he was going to burn down the synagogue, he was going to expel the Jews. It was all going to be over for them. And on the day before the payment was to be made, he was assassinated by his own soldiers, and the decree disappeared, and the Jews of Alexandria till our time celebrated that day as the Purim of Alexandria. For over 400 years it was celebrated as the Purim of Alexandria because the Alexandrian Jewish community was saved from this terrible fate. After the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, so then great Talmidei Chachomim, great Spanish Jews came to Egypt, and they helped rebuild the community. So the Ari, for instance, was a Talmud of Rebbe Tzalel Ashkenazi. Rebbe Tzalel Ashkenazi is the author of the Shita Mekubetzet, which is one of the great works of anthology of Rishonim. So he did it on 5 basic books of the Talmud, Bava Basra, Bava Metzia, Bava Kama, and he did it on Ksubis, and it was one of the great works. It still is. It's studied in all the yeshivot today. It's really one of the basic books because he anthologized the works of all of the great Spanish Rishonim and presented it in an order that could be studied. And this is at a time when you couldn't have all the books yourself. So if you had the Shita Mekubetzet, which means the anthology of all of these great commentaries, So then in one book, so to speak, you had everything that you needed. So he was in Egypt. The Radvaz, Reb David ibn Zimra, was in Egypt. Reb Yaakov Beirav began in Egypt. The Rebbe of Reb Yosef Karo. Eventually, they all moved to the land of Israel. But they all started in Egypt, and they founded academies, they founded yeshivot, and they brought the influence of the great Spanish knowledge and world view. They brought them all to Egypt. Egypt also was a center of Sabbatean heresy. The Egyptians believed in Shabtai Tzvi. Many of the great rabbis of Egypt believed in him. Even 40 years after his death, there were rabbis in Egypt that still proclaimed Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah. By the way, it is in Egypt that the river Sambation got its name. You know, there was the famous river Sambation. So Sambation is a corruption of the word Shabbos, Sabbath, because the river is supposed to stop only on Shabbat. So that's where so there were people who were named. It was a common name amongst Alexandrian Jewry, just like Shabsai is a name for usually boys that were born and circumcised on Shabbos were named Shabtai. So a common name was Sambation also, because it referred to the Sabbath. Brings us to the 1800s. 1800s, everything changes because Europe comes now to Egypt. The British and the French eventually will build the Suez Canal. You have the penetration of colonialism, but you have the ideas, the Western ideas, come now into this world, and the Jews, more than anyone else, bought into all of those ideas. And you had the general schools of Jewish education, no longer only devoted to Torah. You had languages. The Jews spoke French. They not only spoke Arabic now, they spoke French. Montefiore and Adolphe Crémieux visited Egypt. They helped establish schools for the Jews there. And you had a growing Jewish population. You had now about 20,000 Jews. And the Jews were westernized, more westernized than in any other Muslim country. And the Jews adopted Western ways. And there were Jews that came from Italy. And for some reason, the whole town of Leghorn in Italy, Livorno, emigrated to Egypt, to Alexandria. And the Italian Jews were always worldly Jews. They always were exposed to the outside world. And they brought that influence to Egypt as well. Now, there never was any reform in Egypt. There never was any other type of Judaism. But what there was that the people were hardly observant. But they were Jewish, and they were Jewish, proudly Jewish, let us say, but they didn't express their Jewishness necessarily in their religious behavior as they did in the fact that they felt they were a family connected to the Jewish world, etc. At the same time that there was a blood libel in Damascus in 1840, in 1843 there was the same blood libel in Cairo, that a child was missing, and they said the Jews did it. This whole tragedy that happened now in Yerushalayim with the missing child, in a different time and under different circumstances, would be a blood libel. Because any time such tragedy such as this occurs, and the Jews were always blamed for kidnapping children and killing them. The Ottoman Empire fell apart after the First World War. Now, in the First World War in 1917, the census showed that there were 59,000 Jews in Egypt that had grown to that size. 25,000 were in Alexandria and about 35,000 in Cairo, in those two areas. And it was in World War I that Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor organized the Zion Mule Corps, the first Jewish brigade that would fight with the Allies against the Turks. And that was organized in Alexandria because they couldn't do it in Palestine because it was under Ottoman rule, under the Turks. So it was the British, by the time they conquered it, was late. So they organized it in Alexandria, and Jews smuggled themselves into Egypt in order to join this Zion Mule Corps. And Egypt, the Jews in Egypt were split down the middle, as Jews were almost everywhere else, regarding Zionism. Whether or not Zionism was good for the Jews or whether it was not good for the Jews. So there was a large sector of the Egyptian Jewish population that opposed Zionism, not for religious reasons, as much for the fact that they said it would endanger the status with the Arabs, with the Muslim world, and that they felt that it was unnecessary, so to speak. And then there was another large section of Egyptian Jewry that was very pro-Zionist and supported the idea of immigration to the land of Israel. It's interesting that Egyptian Jewry did not come to the land of Israel till they were driven out of Egypt. There was very, very little voluntary immigration, even though it's next door, and to a great extent you could just walk across the border. Did not require any of the efforts that, let's say, Eastern European Jews had to go through in order to come. But as a fact, very, very few of them came. In the Second World War, Egypt basically was pro-German. They were opposed to England, the English rule in the country, and because they were opposed to England, they were pro-German. In fact, one of the points that was always made about Sadat is that during the Second World War he was vocally pro-German, and in fact was arrested by the British for agitating on behalf of the Germans. And in November 1945, after the war ended, there arose a party called Young Egypt, which was a copy of the group in Turkey, the Young Turks, who wanted Egyptian independence, Egyptian nationalism, who wanted to drive out the Western powers, especially England that was in the country, and they perpetrated a great pogrom in Alexandria and in Cairo. So that in Cairo a synagogue and a Jewish hospital and an old age home were burned down with the people in it. And the British and the Egyptians were unable to restore order before hundreds and hundreds of Jews were killed. This is in 1945. In 1947, when the United Nations resolution was passed, so then in Egypt they passed a law saying that only Egyptian citizens were legally entitled to work. Most of the Jews were not citizens. They lived there all the time, but they were not official citizens. And under the law, therefore, Jews lost their property, they lost their ability to work, they lost their ability to make a living, and the situation turned very bad. At that time, King Farouk was the king, and when the War of Independence took place, the Egyptian army was the main army of the Arabs. It led the attack. It was supposed to be the most victorious, and it ended up being the most ignominious. It suffered terrible defeats. And so when the army returned home, Nasser and Naguib made a revolution, and they threw King Farouk off the throne, and they took over the country, and they confiscated all Jewish property in the country. It's estimated that between approximately $25 million worth of Jewish assets were taken away from them, you know, without naturally anybody ever talking about compensation. Even in the Egyptian peace treaty with Israel, it was completely ignored. And between 1948 and 1952, 25,000 Egyptian Jews left Egypt. About 14,000 came here to the land of Israel. It's that left about 35,000 Jews still in the country. Nasser took the leaders of the Jewish community and he accused them of being spies for Israel. There was a show trial of 13 leaders. 2 of them were executed. Others received long prison sentences. And the Jews started to get the hint. After the Sinai campaign in 1956, when Egypt was defeated again by Israel, so then there was a mass exodus of Jews encouraged by Nasser. And it's interesting that 15,000 Egyptian Jews went to Brazil. There's a large Egyptian Jewish community in Sao Paulo and in Rio. And 9,000 went to the United States, 9,000 went to Argentina, and 4,000 went to Great Britain. So again, even though it was next door to the state of Israel, Israel did not benefit, so to speak. It was in 1956, by the way, that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was born in Egypt and educated in Egypt, went to yeshiva in Egypt, was a well-known Talmid Chacham then at a very young age, that he came to Eretz Yisrael with his family from Egypt at that time. We all know that the Jewish community thereafter dwindled away into nothing. As I mentioned, then came the Six-Day War, which really ended the Jewish community, and whatever was left of the Jewish community was ended in the Yom Kippur War. And even after the peace treaty, after Sadat visited Jerusalem and the peace treaty was signed, no Jews moved back to Egypt. And Jews, whichever Jews were left, whatever Jews were left, trickled out of the country. And I mentioned today, they say only about 40 Jews left. There's the great synagogues of Elijah the prophet and other famous synagogues in Alexandria and in Cairo that are tourist attractions. But today, even that doesn't count because of the situation of the tension between Israel and Egypt and the Muslim world. There almost are no Jewish tourists that go to Egypt. Finally, there's a great legend. You know, in the Torah it says you're not supposed to go back to Egypt. And the Jews always were in Egypt for 2,500 years. So the rabbis found that for various reasons, perhaps the ban did not apply. Either it applied only in that generation, or it applied in biblical times, or whatever. But the great legend is, I've seen it recorded many times, but I've never seen the document itself, that Maimonides, the Rambam, would sign his letters, Anochi Moshe ben Maimon Asfardi, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, the Spaniard, ha'over b'chol yom b'shlosha lavin Shabbatorah, who violates every day 3 prohibitions in the Torah, because it says 3 times in the Torah that Jews should not return to Egypt, and he lived in Egypt all of the time. Now, whether or not that's actually the fact or not, I can't guarantee. But it says, again, the idea in the back of the mind of the Jewish people. So even though this great community existed for 2,500 years, it's off the map today. It doesn't exist for us any longer, but it had a long and glorious history and contributed to the Jewish world greatly.